August 17, 1966, was an ordinary Wednesday in Campos dos Goitacazes, a mid-sized city in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Two men left their homes that morning with no apparent urgency, no visible distress, no explanation to the people who knew them. Miguel José Viana was 34 years old, a skilled electronic technician with a stable reputation and a family that depended on him. His colleague Manoel Ferraz was 32, equally experienced, equally unremarkable in the eyes of those around him. The two men told their families they were traveling to the nearby city of Niteroi to purchase supplies for their electronics business. It was the kind of errand that required no special explanation. Nobody asked twice. Nobody had any reason to worry. Within 72 hours, both men would be dead on a remote hilltop, their bodies arranged in a manner that investigators had never encountered in their careers and would spend decades trying to explain. The drive from Campos to Niteroi covered roughly 300 kilometers. Witnesses later confirmed that the two men arrived in the city of Niteroi on the afternoon of August 17th and moved through its commercial center without drawing attention. They visited a local bar and purchased a bottle of mineral water. At a small shop nearby, they bought 2 yellow raincoats. A shop employee remembered the transaction clearly because the men appeared calm and focused, behaving like two people running through a checklist of tasks. They were not nervous. They were not arguing. They paid, collected their purchases, and left. From that point forward, their movements became far more difficult to trace. The trail of concrete evidence narrowed sharply into silence. 3 days passed with no contact. The families in Campos waited, then grew uneasy, then alarmed. On August 20th, 1966, a young boy was flying a kite on the slopes of Morro do Vintém, a steep and largely uninhabited hill on the outskirts of Niteroi. The area had no formal paths, no businesses, no reason for people to spend extended time there. The boy noticed something wrong in the low vegetation partway up the hillside and alerted adults nearby. When the first people reached the location, the scene before them stopped them in place. 2 men in formal suits were lying side by side on spread-out raincoats, their bodies completely still and already showing the early signs of decomposition. Over their eyes, each man wore a handmade lead mask with no lenses, covering the upper half of the face like something constructed for a specific and deliberate purpose. Police and forensic teams reached Morro do Vintém within hours of the initial discovery. The bodies were arranged with a precision that immediately separated this from a random crime. The 2 men were positioned parallel to each other, lying on their backs, their hands resting at their sides with an unnatural composure. The lead masks were thick, carefully shaped, and fit snugly over the eyes and nose. They had clearly been made with intent and worn deliberately. There were no signs of physical violence on either body, no bullet wounds, no cuts, no evidence of a struggle in the surrounding vegetation. The ground around them was undisturbed. Whatever had happened on that hillside, it had happened quietly and without resistance. Near the bodies, investigators found an empty bottle of mineral water and 2 crumpled towels. A small notebook was also recovered from the scene. Inside, written in a plain and businesslike hand, was a brief set of instructions that forensic examiners found deeply unsettling. The note read, in essence, that the writers intended to be at a specified location by 4:30 in the afternoon, that they would ingest capsules at 6:30, that after the effect of those capsules took hold, they were to protect the metals and wait for the mask signal. The note offered no names, no further context, no indication of who had written the instructions or who was meant to receive them. It was a protocol, a set of steps to follow, and both men appeared to have followed them exactly. Identifying the victims was straightforward. Viana and Ferraz were reported missing from Campos. Investigators confirmed their identities through documents found on the bodies. The next priority was determining the cause of death. Forensic pathologists conducted full autopsies, but the results delivered one of the most frustrating outcomes in Brazilian forensic history. Because 3 days had passed in the August heat before the bodies were found, decomposition had already advanced to the point where standard toxicological testing could not produce reliable results. The analysis was inconclusive. No poison was identified with certainty. No trauma was identified. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. That designation would remain unchanged for the rest of the century. Investigators turned their attention to the lives of the 2 men before the trip. Neither Viana nor Ferraz had a criminal record. Neither had enemies that family members or colleagues could name. Both were regarded as diligent and somewhat introverted professionals who took their technical work seriously. Their electronic repair business had been operating for several years without incident. Friends and relatives described them in nearly identical terms as quiet men, who kept to themselves and spoke little about their private interests. But as detectives pressed deeper into their backgrounds, a specific and consistent thread emerged from multiple independent sources. Both men had for some time been deeply interested in the subject of paranormal phenomena, specifically in contact with extraterrestrial beings. The paranormal subculture in Brazil during the 1960s was not a fringe curiosity confined to isolated individuals. A number of organized groups had formed in cities across the country, some with formal membership structures, regular meeting schedules, and elaborate belief systems. These groups shared information through correspondence, private publications, and word-of-mouth networks that operated largely outside public view. Investigators learned that Viana and Ferraz had both been active participants in at least one such circle operating in the Campos region. The precise nature of their involvement was difficult to reconstruct because the group had no official records, and its members were understandably reluctant to speak openly with police. What emerged was fragmentary but consistent. The 2 men had been preparing for some kind of deliberate contact attempt. The lead masks became the central object of the investigation and the detail that gave the case its enduring name. Metallurgists and industrial safety specialists consulted by police confirmed that masks of this type were used in certain technical applications involving radiation or intense light sources, where conventional eye protection was insufficient. Their construction required some knowledge of metalworking. The masks found on the hillside had been made by hand, but with reasonable skill. The question of why 2 men preparing to make contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence would need radiation-blocking lead eye protection was one that investigators could not resolve through any conventional line of reasoning. It suggested a belief system operating according to its own internal logic, one that assumed a specific and potentially dangerous form of energy would be present at the moment of contact. Detectives reconstructed the final hours of the 2 men based on witness accounts gathered in Niteroi. After purchasing the raincoats and water, Viana and Ferraz were seen boarding a local bus that ran toward the area near Morro do Vintém. A bus driver recalled 2 passengers matching their description. They were carrying items wrapped in paper or fabric. They sat together and did not speak loudly. When the bus reached the stop closest to the hillside, the 2 men disembarked and walked in the direction of the hill. No one who saw them during this time reported anything alarming. They appeared purposeful, organized, and completely calm. There was no indication that they were being followed or coerced. Every available piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Both men had arrived at Morro do Vintém by their own decision and for a reason they had planned in advance. The note recovered from the scene was subjected to extensive analysis. Handwriting experts determined that it had been written by one of the victims, most likely Viana, based on pen pressure patterns and letter formations. The reference to capsules was interpreted by investigators as the most critical line in the document. The most plausible theory at the time was that the men had ingested some form of psychoactive or hallucinogenic substance as part of a ritual they believed would alter their consciousness enough to perceive or attract non-human contact. Whether those capsules contained a lethal dose, or whether the dose interacted fatally with other factors, could not be determined given the state of the bodies when they were found. The capsules themselves were never recovered. The investigation expanded outward into the network of paranormal groups that had been active in the region during the preceding years. Police interviewed dozens of individuals who had attended meetings similar to those Viana and Ferraz participated in. Several of these contacts produced information about a broader practice among certain groups of staging what were called contact attempts on elevated terrain. At specific times and under specific conditions, wearing protective gear against the energies believed to accompany such encounters. Lead, in the belief system held by some of these groups, was understood to shield the human body from harmful emissions produced by craft or entities of non-terrestrial origin. The masks were not a curiosity or an ornament. They were considered essential protective equipment for the procedure the men believed they were undertaking. One former member of a contact group based in a neighboring municipality told investigators that Viana and Ferraz had spoken with unusual intensity about an encounter they were planning in the weeks before their deaths. This person described them as convinced that a successful contact was imminent, and that the conditions on Morro do Vintém at a specific date and time had been communicated to them through channels the group considered reliable. The source refused to elaborate on the nature of those channels or identify who else had received similar instructions. The fear in this individual was visible to the officers conducting the interview. Whether that fear stemmed from guilt, from grief, or from concern about personal exposure remained unclear throughout the questioning. No suspects were ever formally charged in connection with the deaths. The Brazilian federal police reviewed the case multiple times over the following decades. Investigative journalists revisited it repeatedly as the story gained international attention in the 1970s and beyond. Each new review encountered the same insurmountable wall. The toxicology results were too degraded to be actionable. The paranormal network the men moved in had no formal structure to subpoena or compel. The note in the notebook, while deeply strange, was not sufficient evidence of criminal involvement by any third party. The case remained, in legal terms, open and unresolved. The families of both men suffered the particular cruelty of a death that produced no explanation. Viana left behind a wife and children in Campos, who gave interviews in the years following the discovery, and described a man who had become increasingly absorbed in his paranormal interests in the period before the trip. His wife recalled that he had spoken in the final weeks of a significant event that he expected to occur soon. She had not pressed him for details. Ferraz had fewer close relatives, but those who knew him described a similar pattern of growing intensity and focus in the months before his death. Both families were left without a verdict, a criminal conclusion, or a medical certainty to hold against the loss. The case attracted sustained attention from researchers outside Brazil, as the details circulated through international publications focused on unexplained phenomena. The combination of elements, specifically the formal attire, the lead masks, the remote hilltop, the cryptic note, the absence of any identifiable cause of death, made the case uniquely resistant to conventional explanation and uniquely amenable to speculation. Dozens of theories accumulated around it over the years. Some researchers pointed to the possibility of accidental poisoning from a substance the men had prepared themselves without understanding its full toxicity. Others focused on the potential involvement of other members of the contact network who had provided the capsules and who may have survived the same procedure by chance or by not following through. A specific theory that gained traction among forensic researchers in later decades centered on the possibility of cardiac arrest triggered by a toxic compound consumed voluntarily. Certain hallucinogenic substances, when taken in high doses or combined with other compounds, are capable of inducing fatal arrhythmias. If the capsules contained such a mixture, if the men took them simultaneously as the note suggested, a near-simultaneous cardiac event was medically plausible. This would explain the absence of a struggle, the composed positioning of the bodies, the lack of any visible trauma. It would not explain who prepared the capsules or whether that preparation was done with knowledge of the lethal outcome. The Morro do Vintém site became a location of ongoing local fascination in Niteroi. Over the years following the discovery, the hillside attracted visitors who treated it as a site of significance. A small number of further unexplained incidents in the immediate area were reported to local police, though none approached the gravity of the 1966 deaths. The hill itself remained accessible and unchanged. The raincoats eventually deteriorated. The lead masks were retained as evidence and later transferred to storage at a Brazilian forensic archive, where they remained catalogued under a case number that carried no resolution. The mineral water bottle was also preserved and examined multiple times for residue, but testing never produced a confirmed match to any identifiable toxin at concentrations that could be declared lethal with certainty. Brazilian television and print media returned to the case at regular intervals across 4 decades. Each revival of public interest brought forward new witnesses claiming peripheral knowledge of the events, new analyses of the note, or new theories about the network that Viana and Ferraz had been part of. A documentary produced in the 1980s tracked down several individuals who had known the two men and who described in greater detail the belief system circulating within paranormal groups in the region during the 1960s. These accounts consistently described a framework in which physical preparation, specific timing, elevated terrain, sensory alteration through ingested substances were considered the necessary conditions for successful extraterrestrial contact. The men had followed that framework precisely. Whether they believed it, whether someone had manipulated that belief for purposes that were never uncovered, remained an open question. Among all the details that accumulated around the case over the decades, one continued to hold the attention of investigators and researchers with particular force. The note in the notebook was written in the calm, procedural tone of someone following an established protocol, not composing it for the first time. The steps were numbered. The times were precise. The reference to protecting the metals and waiting for the mask signal implied a sequence of events that extended beyond the capsule ingestion, suggesting that at least one of the men expected to remain conscious and functional after taking whatever substance the capsules contained. Someone had given them this protocol. Someone had defined the steps and the timing and the location. That person, or those people, were never found. In 1988, a Brazilian journalist conducting a long-form investigation into the case uncovered documentation suggesting that a small and secretive group operating in the Campos and Niteroi region during the mid-1960s had sent multiple teams to elevated sites across the state of Rio de Janeiro in the period between 1964 and 1966. The 1966 attempt on Morro do Vintém was believed to be the final one. Whether other attempts had produced injuries or deaths that went unreported was impossible to determine. The group itself had dissolved entirely by the early 1970s. Its members dispersed and largely untraceable. The journalist was unable to identify any surviving member willing to speak on record about the specific events of August 1966 or the origin of the protocol that Viana and Ferraz had carried with them to the hillside. The Brazilian federal government officially classified the case as unsolved in a 1997 administrative review of cold criminal and forensic files. The classification acknowledged the absence of a confirmed cause of death, the absence of identified suspects, the impossibility of conducting meaningful new forensic work, given the degradation of available biological material. The file remained active in a nominal sense, subject to reopening if new physical evidence came forward. No such evidence had emerged as of the most recent review. The deaths of Miguel José Viana and Manoel Pereira Ferraz on Morro do Vintém in August 1966 remained exactly what they had been from the moment that boy flying his kite on the hillside looked down into the low brush and saw two still figures lying side by side in the afternoon heat.